of starting the expert talk. And as I said, we will be recording. Thanks. The recording has started. So let me start with a very, very warm welcome on behalf of the International Alliance Against Health Risks in Wildlife Trade to our fourth expert talk. My name is Constanze Riedle, and I'll have the pleasure to accompany you in the next 90 minutes. And let me just say a few words on the Alliance and on the expert talk. The International Alliance Against Health Risk in Wildlife Trade, as you might know, believes that identifying and naming the problems and the possible solutions to health risks in the entire contact chain with wildlife really needs a coordinated approach. And in doing so, in realizing and believing so, what we try to do is form an inclusive and interdisciplinary platform to discuss the challenges and formulate solutions on these aspects, especially in order to prevent future pandemic outbreaks. We have, as part of our work, already hosted 3 expert talks from a whole range of topics, including Craig Stevens, Richard Koch, Anand Caceres, and Catherine Machalaba, looking into diverse aspects, including scientific evidence on pathogens, but also on effective interventions and entry points to public policy options. And I'm thrilled, and the whole team here at the International Alliance is really thrilled that you, Nicole, took the time and take the time for our 4th expert talk to really bring us to a new aspect and a new perspective that needs to be looked at. Your talk is titled, and we looked into how best to formulate this, The Intersections of Indigenous Peoples, Health and Wildlife. And during this online session, you will provide us insight and reflections on the inclusion of Indigenous peoples within wildlife contact and trade related discussion and potential implications within the One Health and greater planetary health approaches to dealing with these complex problems. You will also, and I think that's especially important for us to look into, you will also elaborate on international mechanisms and protections for Indigenous peoples that need to be considered when developing and operationalizing processes that may affect Indigenous cultural identity, traditional knowledges, and practices as it pertains to wildlife subsistence. And who better to invite to do that than you? Let me say a few words on you to introduce you for everybody online to know who is speaking, and then hand over to you. So Dr. Nicole Redvers, ND and MPH, is a member of the Deninu-Kwe First Nation in Denende in Northwest Territories. I hope I got that pronunciation right, and has worked with Indigenous patients, scholars, and communities around the globe her entire career. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine and the Department of Indigenous Health at the University of North Dakota, where she helped develop and launch the first Indigenous Health PhD program. Dr. Redvers, you are co-founder and current board chair of the Canadian charity, the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation, based in Yellowknife, Northwestern Territories, providing traditional Indigenous-rooted land-based wellness supports to Northerners. You have also been actively involved at regional, national, and international levels, promoting the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives in both human and planetary health research and practice. And you are author of the trade paper book titled The Science of the Sacred, Bridging Global Indigenous Medicine Systems and Modern Scientific Principles. And with that short overview of your accomplished career so far and your expertise, let me hand over to you, and we're thrilled to listen to you, and the floor is yours for us, I would say, the next 45 minutes or so until we get into the discussion. Please, Nicole, it's all yours.
Thank you, Masicho. Appreciate the warm introduction and the space and time to be with you all here today to discuss some of these topics. Now, it's really important to contextualize the orientation of my presentation today, which is based fundamentally not only on providing knowledge, but also providing worldview. Because when it comes to interactions with other cultures, communities, and peoples, having a better understanding of the context of worldview in relation to a topic is incredibly important, not minimizing, of course, the additional information presented. Now, when it comes to being a clinician, being a researcher, being a community member in an Indigenous a nation, we have to be in relation to our work, to our culture, to our greater community. And it's important to locate myself in that purposeful way in order to demonstrate respect for, but also to remain accountable to all my relations, or Salotina, as we say in my Denisutline language. Now, when it comes to rooting this perspective, we often think through what we call Indigenous communities, a decolonized methodology of being. And in fact, it's very rare within scientific presentations or even research circles to be able to put your roots and relationality of where you come from, let alone your family and who those roots are. But without our identities and who we are as Indigenous people, we have no place. And this land placement, this root within our families, ensures that accountability to our communities, that we don't speak for, but we speak from. Now, it's important to note that my Indigenous way of being in the world, or sometimes termed my ontology, in addition to the way of applying knowledge in the world, or sometimes termed my epistemology, and also my lived experience, has been informed by tens of thousands of years of memories that are stored in my region's stories. And stories are our main method, if we could say, rooted directly in the lands that we come from. And George Kajati aptly describes this relationship by stating that the culture's vitality is literally dependent on individuals in community with the natural world. Indigenous cultures are an extension of the story of the natural community of a place and evolve according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. Therefore, I must honor always my ancestors and my elders, as anything I share or talk about is not my knowledge. It's not my area of expertise. This is the collective knowing of a group of people that stretches thousands of years, passed down through oral stories by our people. Now, my own Indigenous research methodologies, if we could stem, as noted, from a rooted decolonized state of being that is premised essentially on 4 Rs, which is respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility, with absolute direct underpinnings to our kinship relationships with all planetary elements and beings, ranging from the micro to the meta level. Now, this methodology is also exemplified by how we utilize our terminology to demonstrate strength-based relationships to the lands that we come from. For example, even in the written word, land with a capital L being an entity with whom we have a relationship with, comparatively to land denoted with a small l, referring to a mere geographic place. And this, again, strength of language comes in as a part of our relationship and our reciprocal responsibility to our people. Now, this idea of how we formulate our relationships are rooted in a framework of knowing that prizes interconnectedness as a basic and fundamental natural law, or sometimes called first law. So if we think through how to turn this interconnected relationship to all entities into a methodology for research, data gathering, or practice, how would we do that? Well, from our perspective, there is a methodology. There's been a scientific, evidence-informed method in existence for thousands of years, and how to live and know the world around us, including with wildlife. Traditional Indigenous knowledge systems are based on sacred natural laws, which then define what we call traditional protocols, which then give a framework for both old but also modern world ways of knowing. Yet, in the spirit of scientific hegemony that has pervaded most branches of Western research, practice, and inquiry, knowledge democracy has not prevailed. There's a term I like to use called epistemological pluralism, which is a complex term. However, it recognizes and appreciates that in any given research or practice context, There may be several valuable ways of knowing, and that accommodating this plurality can lead to more successful integrative study and practice. Yet this has not really been prioritized in many cases in our systems of learning or in applications in the real world to complex problems, such as the one we are here to talk about today. So before we can really address issues of equity in regard to any given topic, we must also consider or understand how even ways of knowing, ways of being in the world, and ways of carrying out inquiry and therefore solving problems are also steeped in considerations of social justice and the mere democracy of our knowledges. Now, to root our conversation here today, I just want to provide a bit of basic information on Indigenous peoples for those that may not be as familiar. We have more than 476 million Indigenous peoples around the globe. And I highlight that Indigenous peoples are capitalized, and I like to make that note because often it's not within written discourse, and it should be, which make up about 6% of the global population. We live on every inhabited continent in the globe, and unfortunately majority have very low standards of health, accounting for about 19% of the extreme poor, with a life expectancy up to 20 years lower than the life expectancy of non-Indigenous peoples worldwide. And this statistic is not specific to low-income or middle-income countries. It is also in high-income countries. Many Indigenous groups are not formally recognized in their respective countries, and unfortunately, there's a large lack of recognition a large lack of data that results as part of this lack of recognition. Because when we don't have recognition, we can't obviously collect data. Now, people may be very aware in the space, of course, that Indigenous people currently host and live in areas that hold 80% of the world's biodiversity, yet inhabit only 22% of the Earth's surface. So in bringing in context from the previous slide, 6% of the world's population right this moment host 80% of the world's biodiversity. 6% of the world's population hold 80% of the current world's biodiversity, and they manage or have tenure rights over at least 38 million square kilometers in 87 countries or politically distinct areas on all inhabited continents, as noted. Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations, perhaps they're doing something right. And why then is there a continued marginalization of their knowledges and leadership around the world? Now, part of it is the lens that we view the world. And the lens of the world really affects how we see our innate hierarchy of ourselves over all other beings on the planet. And I really love this slide presented by Lucero and Cruz, depicting this traditional anthropocentric or human-centric kind of I or ego picture, where of course humans are on the top of the triangle here above all else on Earth, comparatively to the Mayan cosmocentric worldview, but of course the worldview in many Indigenous nations across the world, where humans are a part of that eco, a part of the we, the relationship, the interconnectedness between all beings, not above, not below, but in relationship with. Now, what is also important is denoted here, because really it's showcasing an interspecies equity approach, an interspecies equity approach that is seen from a place of relationality or relationship. We are all interconnected with no hierarchy between us when it comes to how the natural systems operate in the world, including with our animal relatives. As Polygon Allen of the Pueblo people stated, we are the land, the earth is the mind of the people, as we are the mind of the earth. The land is not really the place separate from ourselves where we act out the drama of our isolate destinies. It is not a means of survival, a setting for our affairs. It is rather a part of our being, dynamic, significant, real. It is ourself. Land is ourself. Again, our interconnection has no limits. Now, this interconnected nature is depicted here by this figure on this slide. We, meaning humans, our wildlife relatives, and even microbes, are unified communities due to our interconnectedness on all fields of structure and influence. Yet there is also a clear interrelationship with repercussions for not living in balance with the planet. as our Earth-centered jurisprudence systems govern both nature and also global systems, meaning there is a unity of natural laws or first laws between us, no matter the species we are. The sun will continue to rise from the east and set in the west. The moons will continue to affect the tides, but Mother Earth will also respond to our interactions with her, which ultimately affects all other life forms. So essentially, we are nested in interconnected relationships with other innate and applied knowledges, but also beings, which then impact the health of our communities and ecosystems. And this bi-directional impact of various nested levels is incredibly important as we help to form our reality, just as much as we are bound by some of these constants. So, in the vision for a healthy future, it is important to create the conditions that enable this overcoming of the dissonance so often felt between being in nature, nature that surrounds us, to the reality of being of nature, nature that embodied us. So ultimately, what we call natural or first law is the way of living on land or country handed down through countless generations. It sustains a web of relationships between the human and non human world and forms a pattern which is life itself. And this pattern must be recreated and the law followed to sustain life. Now, natural or first law is the English translation of these terms. However, each nation has their own indigenous language terms that would represent the concepts of of natural law or first law. Now, indigenous traditional knowledges are actually directly nested within these concepts of natural law. And they're very much uniquely rooted within the lands that they come from globally. Natural or first law derives from land and is translated through indigenous traditional knowledges through the understanding of our protocols. Now, how can we translate these natural laws? Through various systems. And of course, folks have heard likely of Indigenous Traditional Knowledge Systems, or TKS, which again are enacted through these protocols. And when I say protocols, I mean it's almost like a type of rule or guideline that needs to be followed to keep life and community in balance. That's probably the best English translation, although it doesn't do justice to the depth of the term. So we, as humans, wildlife, and microbes, are really embedded again into traditional knowledge systems that are themselves embedded into natural law that guide the universe. And the traditional protocols we follow honor this understanding. Now, folks have likely heard, as noted previously about traditional knowledge systems, but just to be clear on a few points, I want to reiterate that traditional knowledge systems are really a combination of know-how, skills, and practices that are developed, sustained, and passed on from generation to generation within a community, often forming an integral part of its culture or spiritual identity. It is no less scientific than Western knowledge systems. To tell an elder that something is not scientific when they know how to read the weather, the snow, the ice, the animals, all of these things. It is a different conceptualization of science, but it is indigenous science. Mostly oral as opposed to written knowledge systems. They include both tangible and intangible knowledges, and that's really incredibly important as it will come to some of the international mechanisms described a little bit later on. It is evidence informed by thousands of years of empirical knowledge, as opposed to the evidence-based Western scientific framework that has there, although we're seeing some crossover happening in more recent times. So thinking through how we can conceptualize working with traditional knowledge systems in the modern context of partnership in the broadest sense of the word is potentially through a concept called two-eyed seeing, which was formerly coined by a Mi'kmaq elder whose name is Albert Marshall. He's from the eastern part of Canada. And two-eyed seeing is to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing and to see from the other eye with the strengths of Western ways of knowing and to use both of these eyes together. And Elder Albert indicates that two-eyed seeing is this gift of multiple perspectives treasured by many Indigenous peoples, which really harkens back to the epistemological pluralism term that I had noted previously. Oh, my slides are getting ahead of me here. Now, this statement made by 60 Indigenous community members and experts who gathered to discuss climate change, but also traditional knowledges, food sovereignty, and other issues at a convening organized by Cultural Survival. Also, the International Indian Treaty Council was involved, is really a great example of the understanding of the need for respectful partnership while also being firm on what partnership actually looks like from an Indigenous perspective. And they stated very explicitly, we recognize the extreme crisis that we are facing through our Indigenous science and ways of knowing and the realities we are living on the ground. If we agree to share this knowledge for the good of all humanity, it must be based on respect for our rights and the commitment by countries to implement real changes in their methods of production and concepts of development. So when we think through what that looks like, because most often in terms of this particular topic area space, it often involves research processes, partnerships, transdisciplinary collaborations. And what's really incredibly important to understand is some of the viewpoint that has occurred between the dissonance of Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of thinking through what health research or research means generally. And one of the key things that I want to highlight here is this concept of research benefit. And research benefit does not translate equally across Indigenous and non-Indigenous contexts, or even at different levels at which impact is manifested. Traditionally, impact and therefore benefits has been measured, of course, through our most often in Western terms by peer accountability in academia as opposed to social accountability. Um, while academics often talk about impact at various nested levels, Indigenous people often talk about ethical positions and tangible benefits, such as responses and solutions to issues, of course, that are meaningful to their lives. There's been a history of the parachute or the helicopter research. And this is very much in front of minds of communities, this idea of extraction. And there was decades and decades where it was very common for scientists to drop out of the so-called ivory tower into the field site, often in a less developed region of the world, extracting data, and then zipping back to the institution to analyze and communicate their results without really engaging the people living in the region within a meaningful way. Now, there's been some movement in this regard, particularly on development and a push of methods like community-based participatory research or its variants, participatory evaluation, collaborative inquiry. There's a number of new terms, of course, that have come up. And it has been in some cases regarded by some as an acceptable approach to Indigenous-based research. However, one of the things that is often not talked about is some of the challenges that come through this perspective. And I want to highlight some of these because it's becoming more common to think of CBPR in more words as opposed to action, because there are a number of complex ethical issues that arise without really the true examination of what partnership means with local communities, what does collaboration mean, but more importantly, the issue of power. And really the questions about how do we blur at the community level the boundaries between research and researched, academic, activists, how do community rights fit in, conflict and democratic representation, really important ownership and dissemination of data findings and publications, which I'll broach on shortly, privacy, and of course, institutional ethical review processes, which often happen in larger institutional settings and not at the community level. I think this box does a really good job of showcasing some of the challenges that have occurred in CBPR through the translation process to community, because each one of these bullet points really depicts a different level of CBPR, all the way from the first bullet where the project is completely community controlled and managed. There's no professional researchers involved, going all the way down through having a little bit more involvement with researchers, but it's still managed by and working for the community. Then you're going a little bit more to co-production, where there's more equal partnership between professional researchers and community members. And then you have projects still under the CBPR heading, which are controlled by professional researchers, but with greater or lesser degree of community partnership. So this could be in the form, I'm sure people have heard of community advisory boards, included in the design or dissemination, training community researchers, undertaking some or all of the data gathering analysis, and then of course using participatory methods. However, I want to be clear that that is the last rung on the CBPR in terms of the involvement, and many Indigenous communities are pushing more and more to have that first bullet point. In fact, there's been, particularly within the Americas, changing to tribally based participatory research as a term to denote the control and management directly within the community as opposed to within institutional homes. Now, the last piece in terms of this research bit that I wanted to just touch on, which is the data dependence issue, that is, again, a large and burgeoning topic within Indigenous communities, and it's very much a less explored area. How data, historically, but also contemporarily, has been a tool to marginalize Indigenous peoples, eradicate their ways of life, and essentially rewrite the histories based on the perspectives and the worldview on those that are collecting the data, as opposed to communities themselves. And this data dependency is really sustained through a paradox of scarcity and abundance. Extensive data are often collected about Indigenous peoples and nations, but rarely by or for Indigenous peoples and nation purposes. And much of the existing data and data collection methods do not recognize or privilege Indigenous worldviews. So in thinking through, what do we consider Indigenous data at the community level? And it is very broad in terms of what the conceptualization of that word is. Any facts, knowledge, or information about a Native nation and its tribal citizens, lands, resources, cultures, communities, information ranging from demographic profiles to educational attainment rates, but also maps of sacred lands, songs, social media activities. What's incredibly important when it comes to Indigenous data, at least from a community perspective, is this definition encompasses both collective and individual level data. This is where the ethical review boards are missing the mark when it comes to institutional homes that privy individual risk and individual protection, but do not consider the collective community nature. And that does not align with the ethical principles of many Indigenous community operations and must be considered when thinking through the processes of data collection and use with communities. Because data is not a foreign concept in the Indigenous world, we've always been data creators, data users, and data stewards. Data were and are embedded in Indigenous instructional practices and cultural principles. They were recorded through oral history, stories, winter counts, calendar sticks, totem poles, and other instruments that stored information for the benefit of the entire community. And our data systems center on interdependence, not the acquisition of individual knowledge. And they rely on shared responsibility to ensure that this embodiment of collectivism, knowing, being, and doing, really are transmitted throughout our generations. So because of that, there's been a big push for Indigenous data sovereignty, which is the right of each Indigenous nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of the community's data. And Indigenous nations can exercise Indigenous data sovereignty through the interrelated processes of data governance and decolonizing data, because it really has become the new global currency, as we know, and a very powerful force in making decisions and wielding power. Now, I wanted to point out some of the things recently within the literature as we think through, okay, well, how does One Health fit into this when it comes to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledges, and bringing in some of these components that we had just broached previously, whether or not it's community participatory based approaches, whether or not it's in honoring recognition or amplification of Indigenous worldview. There was a systematic review that was done just and published last year examining the concept of One Health for Indigenous communities. And it was very apparent in terms of the review that there was no significant connection in the existing literature body between One Health and Indigenous knowledges. And articles discussed One Health as it pertains to epidemiological surveillance and research. The implications of utilizing One Health towards Indigenous peoples and cultures were not explicitly addressed. There was also another paper, One Health in Indigenous Communities, a critical review of the evidence. Notice it's the same author. The review found that there is a need for studies of high strength with rigorous methods, local leadership, and active involvement of Indigenous viewpoints to be undertaken in Indigenous communities internationally that focus on One Health. It highlights the need to further consider Indigenous viewpoints in research to reduce limitations, increase effectiveness of findings, consider appropriateness of recommendations, and benefit communities. Clearly, there is a gap in terms of the need for the appropriate platform of Indigenous voices, but also Indigenous traditional knowledges as a part of the continuing developing One Health framework. So, in considering some of the implications for One Health, one of the things that's become apparent across all aspects of Indigenous research is really this refocusing to a strength based approach, because a lot of communities are very tired of the historical deficit framing of their communities, which always focus on the things that are wrong, as opposed to the things that are right and the strengths that they bring, the solutions that they have as well to the community, but to the greater global world as well. Strength-based practices requires a reconfiguring of relationships of power, of attending to structure over stereotypes, and privileging Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And this reconfiguration is an ethical prerequisite for an approach that is genuinely strength-based. So I want to just briefly broach this word reciprocity because it's you'll hear it often within Indigenous community contexts. However, there's a misnomer between sometimes the Western definition, which is seen to be very transactional in some cases. You give me something, I give you something back, and reciprocity is so much deeper than that. And in fact, it's at the level of natural law, our first law, that everything comes from reciprocity. We do not engage in reciprocity; we come from reciprocity. It's really this value of mutual obligation and which aims to achieve an equitable distribution of resources, responsibility, and capacity, and to achieve cohesion and survival of the social order. It is an absolute foundational concept and important to be aware of when doing this type of work. Now, when we think through translation of reciprocity into a research context, it really infers inclusion, recognition of partners' contributions, and ensuring that research outcomes include, of course, equitable benefits to local communities or individuals. But most importantly, we need to be aware that how we ascribe and define value by community is really up to them according to their priorities, and of course, hopefully, a meaningful contribute to their cohesion and overall survival. So lastly, along this line, when we consider reform in Indigenous health research or health research broadly, or research broadly when it comes to Indigenous communities, of course, partnership approaches are amendable to achieving impact and benefit in Indigenous research contexts, considering many of the previous slides that I have already covered and some of the subsequent ones that I'll go through on international mechanisms to be aware of. In particular, completely remodeling research processes is very much in need to improve the likelihood of research use. And this, of course, includes Indigenous peoples being directly involved, if not by and with, identifying and prioritizing issues of relevance, incorporating Indigenous traditional knowledges, which we've seen has been substantially lacking in the One Health framework, reporting all data findings, issues of data sovereignty, and then, of course, engagement from the outset. Always reconsidering this value. Whose value are we talking about when we're engaging the project? Is it the outside value or is it value to community? Now, before we broach some of the international mechanisms in the context of considering research or practice, program development, prevention within wildlife and health spaces, it's important to understand the context of self-determination because most of the international mechanisms as it pertains to Indigenous people are based on this. And of course, self-determination in the widest sense really is the right to participate in the democratic process of governance and to influence one's own future, and really embodies the right for all people to determine their own economic, social, and cultural development, and has thus been defined by the International Court of Justice as the need to pay regard to the freely expressed will of peoples. Now, Indigenous peoples have claimed through the 2007 Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People the term peoples, and with it gaining self-determination in action. Now, for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it is today the most comprehensive international instrument on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And it really establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity and well being of Indigenous peoples of the world, and elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to the specific situation of Indigenous peoples. Now, any respective Indigenous nations in a country or community may have declarations or items as a part of their governance that is more stringent or more specific comparatively to UNDRIP. And those always override UNDRIP. By extension. So it is important that to note that UNDRIP is a minimum standard, and communities may in fact have higher standards that they abide by in terms of their community governance or partnerships or otherwise. I want to highlight Article 31 as being particularly pertinent to this topic here today. And one of the rights that Indigenous peoples have is to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, their traditional knowledge. And this is why I was talking about before, our rights are pertain to tangible as well as intangible elements. Stories, spiritual traditions, cultures, knowledges, traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicine, knowledge of the properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, and so on and so forth. And they also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage as it pertains to knowledge, as it pertains to fauna and flora, as it pertains to genetic resources and traditional cultural expressions. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and develop their political, economic, and social systems or institutions to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence, which is very broad in that sense, which includes subsistence of wildlife and development, and to engage freely in all their traditional and other economic activities. Now, the other protocol and the international mechanisms that I wanted to denote is the NAGOA protocol on access and benefit sharing. Now, this is a protocol that arises from the utilization to the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, of course, is an international agreement, which really aims at sharing the benefits arriving from the utilization of genetic resources in a fair and equitable way. However, I want to highlight very specifically that when it comes to genetic resources, or the definition of genetic resources, because when you think about that term, you often think of genetics, but also perhaps other types of plants or so on and so forth. But genetic resources is an incredibly wide concept as per the NAGOA protocol. It includes traditional knowledges. It includes aspects of fauna and flora. It includes seeds. It includes plants. It includes numbers of things as a part of that process. And the objective of the protocol really is the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising, as noted, from the utilization of genetic resources, including by appropriate access to genetic resources, which means access to flora and fauna, access to seeds, access to the things that are a part of their culture, taking into account and by appropriate funding, contributing to the conservation of biological diversity and the sustainable use of its components. Now, one of the additional scopes is that the protocol shall also apply as noted to traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources within the scope of the convention. Now, one thing I didn't mention about UNDRIP, but also is the case with the NAGOA protocol, is because an international mechanism exists for Indigenous people, it doesn't mean that all countries have signed on. In fact, it may be well known that the United States is not a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So by that very nature, they are not signed on to the NAGOA protocol on access and benefit sharing. So these mechanisms would only apply to countries, at least from a legal perspective, that have engaged and signed on to the Convention on Biological Diversity, or in the case of UNDRIP, which originally was not signed on by certain countries, including the country I come from, Canada, but subsequently has signed on to that mechanism. Now, free and prior and informed consent is a specific right that also pertains to Indigenous peoples and also is specifically recognized within UNDRIP. One thing I want to highlight in this context is that once Indigenous people have given their consent to a particular project, research, implementation, whatever it is, they can absolutely withdraw it at any stage. And furthermore, FPIC enables them to negotiate the conditions under which the project will be designed, implemented, monitored, and evaluated, which of course is embedded within the universal right to self-determination. I've listed other relevant legal frameworks here. I'm not going to go into each of them because they're very much similar in terms of different wording, but all of it pertains to access rights to subsistence use, whether or not it's traditional foods that come from wildlife, whether or not it's seed, whether or not it's knowledges, and they have various differences. And I've put the specific article numbers next to each of these, making the clear note before, of course, that things like the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People are not going to be relevant to Ojiak peoples in Kenya. So some of these are regionally specific. Some of them have sign-on from certain countries and other. However, it's important to be aware when you're working in countries what articles and international mechanisms they have signed on to so that you understand the legal rights and protections. But hopefully, at minimum, understand UNDRIP as it pertains to your project work. Many conservationists now acknowledge that mistakes have been made, but in their war against the illegal wildlife trade have rarely troubled to distinguish subsistence hunters from commercial poachers. Some fear that subsistence hunters, although they hunt only for the pot, pose an unacceptable risk to wildlife numbers, even outside the parks. There is little scientific evidence on this. I want to emphasize a clear point as it pertains to the rights and opinions of many Indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples are not a reservoir of high risk when it comes to subsistence, wildlife engagement, and health when their lands and cultures are protected. And that is a very clear caveat as a part of that process. Protecting Indigenous lands lessens the dangers from zoonosis and the transference of animal-based diseases into human infections. Ensuring the rights of Indigenous peoples to their traditional lands can protect against environmental degradation and, by extension, the zoonosis that can accompany it. Wildlife and Indigenous peoples' traditional practices have existed for thousands of years. However, the context around them has forcibly changed. And that is a key piece highlighted through all of these: lands and culture, lands and culture, lands and culture. There is great concern within Indigenous communities that international pandemic policy will further strip them of their internationally enshrined rights. In fact, during the UN Biodiversity 2022 event, which just occurred, Nurgam, who's the chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, stressed that Biodiversity Framework Target 5 ensure that harvesting, trade, and use of wildlife species is sustainable, legal, and safe, must include respect for customary law and sustainable use, coming from our head of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Indigenous peoples are the experts of their landscapes. 6% of the world's population hold 80% of the world's biodiversity. There's a reason for that. Global policies around wildlife use and trade can impact food sovereignty and security, especially of Indigenous peoples. Combining Indigenous knowledge systems with science provides a more holistic understanding of zoonotic risk. Indigenous leadership and engagement in disease monitoring, prevention, and response is vital from the outset and would increase the success of such efforts, as well as ensure the protection of Indigenous rights as outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, I want to finish up with showcasing what Indigenous-based scholarship looks like in practice. Now, recently, a group of global Indigenous scholars, practitioners, land and water defenders, respected elders, and knowledge holders came together to define the determinants of planetary health from an Indigenous perspective. And we wanted to, for once, place Mother Earth in the center and consider what are the determinants that keep her well, remembering that Mother Earth is a broad concept that includes no dimensions of time or space, is inclusive of us, but also the animal relatives as well. And I want to just highlight here a few of the determinants that I think are very relevant to the conversation topic here today that are often minimized within these discussions. The first is the modern scientific paradigm. Now, as we know, Western science is a paradigm that uses the scientific method to theorize, hypothesize, find variables, measure and describe a relationship, usually in mathematical, economic, or even political terms. However, the paradigm is limited in explaining complex relationships over time and can be described sometimes as being too linear, reductionistic, and mechanistic, although there's benefits in certain cases. The overarching interest of Western science is to infer phenomenon to understand the world. However, there is often an underlying implicit interest to find ways to influence, control, and perhaps even modify these phenomenon for human benefit. With an underappreciated connection to Indigenous science, we have, however, seen some of the pendulum swing, particularly within this century, towards a need for more systems-orientated, ecologically based, networking approaches to thinking through the concepts of scientific work within these complex spaces. And this approach is very much aligned, in my mind, with the complexity of One Health, of planetary health, and other complex systems which with people interrelate. Now, the Indigenous scientific method, which is described as contextual, holistic, symbolic, nonlinear, relational, is not limited by time and uses the collective observation of its people to explain natural phenomenon through real but also metaphoric narratives. It's become apparent that society cannot solve complex problems from the same worldview that created them in the first place, as it will continue to perpetuate this disconnect between us and the planet as relatives. And this very much connects with the second determinant of health, planetary health, that was defined, which is that of the interconnectedness within nature. And we wrote specifically, and I quote, ecological demise points to an impaired human relationship with its inner self. Humans are nature and not apart from it. In the broader sense, there is evidence of the loss of an ecologically bound culture identity. And this disconnect from nature manifests itself as a fragmented and disassociated identity that cannot recognize itself as part of a greater system, making it easier to project predatory and abusive impulses onto the environment. Thus, an ideology of independence has resulted in a sense of entitled ownership, a kind of utilitarian perception of the natural world that relates to it through transactional relationships that do not have a sense of responsibility, care, or love, and this worldview will only continue to perpetuate planetary harm. We concluded our paper stating that Indigenous voices are a powerful and beneficial solutions-oriented force for Mother Earth's well-being and for all living beings that inhabit her. We therefore call for an inclusion of wisdom that is not mere knowledge or information, but is an insight that comes from the heart of Mother Earth. So in my final slide, why is this all important for me to state? And I think of the words of Chief Dan George, who was the chief of the Sitzley-Watu First Nation. And he said, "Allow me to learn the ways of your book knowledge so that I may combine it with my natural knowledge and lead the way." We as Indigenous peoples understand especially our younger generation coming up, that a blend of traditional knowledge with modern knowledge is the only way forward sustainably for the planet. And I emphasize here again the concept of epistemological pluralism, recognizing that in any given practice context, there may be several valuable ways of knowing, and that accommodating this plurality can lead to more successful integrative study, solutions, and practice. And ultimately, when it comes down to considering the interrelatedness between humans, wildlife, and health, we must not forget the simple yet powerful words by Terry Teague of the Takla Lake First Nation. Take care of the land, and the land will take care of you. Indigenous knowledges remind us how to walk in the world in a good way, and the path we hopefully decide to walk is together with Mother Earth as our relative. You cannot understand true medicine power in whatever capacity that may be, unless you have an understanding of the nature of things. And to understand the nature of things, you need to be in nature, and you need to connect to the animals, the rocks, the plants, the stars, and the wind. So with this, I want to say Masi Cho. Thank you for your time and attention today. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all to talk about these topics. They're deep and vast topics, so I hope this very brief introduction will stimulate thought and consideration as you go forward in your respective journeys, in your partnerships, in your communities, and your on-the-ground work within this complex space of wildlife and health as we navigate some of our most pressing challenges that we've had. Masi Cho again, and I welcome any questions, comments, or discussion at this time.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nicole. That's wonderful. What a tour de force. Actually, I was still writing something down here. Thank you so much for your, wow, overview, in-depth knowledge, and sharing that with us. Before I voice a couple of comments or questions, rather, let me see and give you the floor, all of the participants. I'm sure most of us are still digesting, trying to take in not only the insights, but also some of the terminology that might be a little novel or distinct from what we sometimes use. So let me see. Is there any comments, any questions from the floor? Amanda, please do start. Thanks for starting. Go ahead.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you very much for that, as you said, very in-depth and full of information in terms of your presentation. Really appreciate that, and a lot of thinking and reflecting on what you said. I wonder if you could comment or just share a little bit more in terms of your thoughts of how we, as a community, we can support Indigenous peoples to put forward their concerns about protection of their lands and their Indigenous lands in the context of this concern about commercial wildlife trade and pandemic risk. Especially, I'm thinking, for example, of a situation that occurred in Laos, where a particular species of salamander is discovered and all of a sudden becomes coveted, mostly in the West as a pet species. And in a very short period of time, those Indigenous communities that have access to those lands to some degree become, they become utilized as extractors of this species. And the species, enters the commercial trade. In this case, not a species they relied on for their subsistence, but did of course know about long before it was discovered by science. And I think in that period of time that the numbers, dropped, that data and that information about that impact, of course, never got to the Indigenous community. They, individuals within the community were involved in the trade, of course, but this whole idea of the big picture, especially when something happens so rapidly, a rapid change in context, this market, then this loss of this resource for this community. So, I mean, that's just one little example, but in some ways something happens so fast. And how do we deal with this issue of time and this long, knowledge of protection in this context of, national laws and treaties, et cetera, that are often, essentially not implemented in fast enough, or the cultural change broadly doesn't happen fast enough for those lands and those resources to truly be protected.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think the word complex often comes up, and there's no minimization of that issue. And one of the first slides, of course, that I presented on was, the substantial marginalization of Indigenous peoples in terms of voice. So often many communities are forced, there's many that have been taken off their traditional lands, even in the African context, of course, for conservation, and now are relying on other means to be able to afford food and other items as well too. So this is really one of those issues where I think those system-based approaches are most appropriate. But what I often like to do is really listen to the system-based approaches of the community and think of those relational components as opposed to the variables that are the issue. Because when we focus on sort of the elements, the animal, the people, the government, the rest of it, it misses the interconnection between them. And that is the difference in how Indigenous science works comparatively to Western ways, because people understand the relationships more than they understand the variables. So when we bring in that conversation of relationships and start doing community mapping processes with knowledge holders that are really derived often from them, where are the barriers in place as a part of this? And most often it ends up coming as a part of some of the colonization process that has occurred, and some of the remaining bits and pieces of that due to the disparities within health, but also socioeconomic status that has existed. So each element is so contextual to the land and the place, but there's almost always elders. There's almost always knowledge holders that are there that are often not brought into those conversations as quiet leaders within their communities, because they often have had the experience of extraction historically that you won't know about them most often. And this is where the young people become particularly helpful, because there are so many amazing young people in many Indigenous nations that have been schooled a little bit into the Western way sometimes, but also still have those connections to communities that are really often, wanting to stand up and engage in protective mechanisms, but they also want to do it in a way that's respective of their own traditional protocols and communities. We have those protocols and ways of doing things. They haven't been translated to Western researchers or contexts because it's always been kind of done the same way, but it's not working. It's not working because we keep trying to do the same thing from the same worldview, just in a little different ways. Maybe we'll try this angle or this angle. It is the fundamental way and approach that is not working. And that's why I'm kind of belittling sort of the point on going to more relational work as opposed to variable work. That, in my mind, is going to make the biggest difference forward, because it aligns with the community values, it aligns with ways of thinking, but most importantly, it allows those community leaders and experts to feel comfortable, to feel confident to come out, because they now feel that their way of viewing the world is valued and not minimized as part of that conversation.
Thanks very much. Amanda, do you have a follow-up question?
No. Nope, thank you very much.
Okay, I actually have a follow-up question, which is why I put up my hand, because as International Alliance, we do try to approach Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples. I'll be very frank here, and I maybe you can help us out here, and I think you already have in some bilateral conversations, Nicole, but maybe some others are tackling similar issues. We do experience some amount of distrust or hesitance, let's say. Us being white, I'm located in Berlin or Frankfurt, and approaching communities and saying we do want to be inclusive. We want to do exactly what you said earlier, combining Indigenous knowledge systems with other scientific evidence to move forward on reducing health risks from dealing with wildlife and respecting subsistence use, et cetera, et cetera. So what would you recommend us towards lowering this hesitance and lowering this, proving that we do mean to change our ways, and as you just mentioned, trying to do things differently, maybe coming from a more relational angle, etc. Can you give us some pointers how to deal with this very understandable hesitance or distrust? Thanks.
Definitely. It's an issue not only in this space, but all spaces. It doesn't really matter what topic that we're talking about, and it's very much relevant, and it doesn't matter if it's a low-income country, middle-income, high-income country, Indigenous peoples, it is the exact same. In fact, it comes up for colorectal cancer screening, it comes up for conservation research, it comes up for everything. And there is a valid reason for that lack of trustworthiness. I often don't use the word mistrust because that puts the playing field in Indigenous communities that they are mistrustful of us. No, there's been a lack of trustworthiness in the environment that has existed due to not only past, but also contemporary harms. One of the things that works the best, because to be frank, a large white organization that has the words wildlife and health, I've heard directly from community members that they keep saying, why do they think our wildlife is a problem? Our wildlife is not the problem. The people are the problem. So, you know, the way that these conversations are even had sort of puts the barrier up right away, because it comes at it with the perception that we're preventing risk from something that's my culture, something that, you know, I very much respect as my relative. I think that the only way to go forward in terms of these mechanisms is not to have organizations like this expecting Indigenous peoples to have a seat at the table. It is allowing and creating funding and movement to have Indigenous peoples organize themselves, to start having these conversations amongst themselves, first and foremost, that they can come up with a collective because they work better collectively, because we are collective people, because that gives the group dynamic of confidence to know that they're working with themselves for solutions and then coming to partnership elsewhere, as opposed to, you know, expecting people, we're just going to open the door and all of a sudden Indigenous peoples are, it's just not going to happen. Even for me, if I'm going into another community, I have to be really careful in terms of my positionality, and I am not assuming myself as a guest. I'm a relative of the North, and I'm here to listen, and I'm here only to listen without any sort of peace in mind. There's an organization called Health and Harmony, which has sort of fomented the radical listening approach that you may have heard of course. And, you know, things like that work because you're not coming in with your own preconceived notions. You're coming in wanting to listen and learn from the communities. And that is what is not happening right now. But it has to be done at the community level. It can't be through the internet. It can't be, you need to have face front on the ground, wanting to listen and really for the purposes of uplifting and amplifying their voice and their solutions as opposed to your own. That will create an environment of trustworthiness that minimizes sort of these contexts of barriers and issues. We have a lot of work to do in the research and frankly, all fields in that regard when it comes to Indigenous nations.
Thanks, Nicole, also for your very frank and clear answers. We might come back to you in operationalizing that if we were to go further down that path. But we also have some further comments. Christina, please.
Nicole, thank you so much. It's great to see you. You know, it's always so inspiring and so humbling to hear your presentation. So thank you so much for that. It was absolutely outstanding. And so, you know, as you know, working at WHO, we have we do have we do take all of these challenges on board, and we're trying really hard actually to think about, well, how can we meaningfully integrate? And I think that in your presentation you really did approach a lot of the key challenges that come across in the implementation of the One Health approach, which is something that we're looking at very closely right now. for obvious reasons. And then we've got these international legal frameworks that are in the process of development. You know, you've got the international treaty or other legal instrument on pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response. That is something that is underway, and maybe at a smaller scale. We've also got an operational framework on biodiversity, climate, and health that is under preparation. That one actually is being carried out by an expert working group on biodiversity, climate, and One Health, and we do have some Indigenous representatives on that expert working group, thankfully. But of course, you know, Indigenous communities are so pluralistic, so they can't speak for everyone. But my question really is this: in a situation in which we do have these international legal frameworks that need to be developed, that are under development, and based on the fact that, I mean, these One Health frameworks are hopefully going to be developed and hopefully implemented in a meaningful way, how can we meaningfully embed or co-create these so as to really bring in those Indigenous voices? I think you touched upon this actually in your previous response, where you were saying it's really about empowerment, and it's really about, you know, making sure that Indigenous peoples can speak for themselves, and that's all critically important and critically valid. But when you're also thinking about timelines, when you're thinking about how do we meaningfully do this within this time scale, can you please give us some insights on how to make that more meaningful? I think it would be tremendously helpful.
Absolutely. Well, I think some of our international groups that really are groups that seek to represent voices from large geographic expanses. I mentioned the International Indian Treaty Council, of course, as you noted, and the Forum on Indigenous Peoples. So they've done an excellent job, and usually are more policy inclined, you know, for participation in those spaces, which hopefully, you know, you guys have been engaging with in that regard. They have really good mechanisms for gaining feedback from local communities. You know, I get 8 emails a week, literally, on various policy mechanisms. So they're going out to large mailing lists of Indigenous community members for feedback. They're not just making decisions in those rooms on their own. You know, they've been having those conversations on side. They're ongoing, you know, through various mechanisms. They'll have internal working groups so that they're bringing the concerns and forefronts of the regions into various areas. The other thing I want to highlight that I think is a minimized component of international policy when it comes to this is this idea of the global north, global south divide that often comes in, which is completely irrelevant when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And circumpolar peoples, for example, are often minimized in terms of those contributions, and still very much rely on wildlife subsistence as a part of their livelihoods, just because of the rural remoteness of some of those communities. But I know for a fact that most communities will likely always refer to those international groups. Cultural Survival also does a very good job. They're very well respected in Indigenous communities for standing up for policy issues as well. And they work quite closely with the International Indian Treaty Council and some of the other partners. I also really strongly encourage, we have an amazing United Nations Youth Indigenous group of folks that are on there, and they are absolutely wonderful. And they have just done amazing work standing in these policy spaces. I was so happy that I saw one yesterday make a motion to the UN that was just brilliant. So I think we also need to not minimize the youth voice in this, who of course are going to have the lived experience going forward. The last thing I want to note on this point is one of the things that I've noticed in the context of many international groups, whether or not it's variants of WHO or the UN or sometimes the other group, is they often have people that are indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge person, or whoever the head is. They're always white men. And I can't figure this out. Why? I mean, if you have components of people that are leading units within these international groups or large organizations that are white men, it does not work. You can be the best communicator, the best partner in the world, and no offense to the people that are in these positions, but it's time to step aside and let Indigenous peoples be in these positions so that they can speak for themselves in their communities. We are past the point of having people speak for us that are not from our lands and our communities. So that's my kind of last bit, and that's more of a personal point.
That's terrific, Nicole. Thank you so much. Just a quick follow-up question on how we reach out to the Indigenous youth group that you were referencing. I think it's supreme. All of the information you provided
Definitely.
is extremely valuable.
I don't say this often, but I'll say it to you. You can send me an email, and for that purpose, I'm happy. But the reason I caveat that is that one of the issues we have as Indigenous peoples who end up being in these spaces is that we get called on for connections. And I always tell people, we are not here to connect communities for you. You need to do the groundwork yourself. But when it comes to these youth, there's a couple that I know would just be very incredibly happy to participate as a part of that. And sometimes if I do have folks that have already sort of agreed and committed to be networked and otherwise, then I'm more than happy to create those opportunities for them. So just send me an email, Christina.
Thanks, and thanks for that offer. Thanks, Nicole. We have another comment, hand up. Claudia Fernandez de Cordoba Farini, I think. Go ahead.
Yes, sorry, thank you. First, I wanted to say thank you so much. I will really keep in mind the points on like zoonotic disease risks and indigenous knowledge. And I particularly also like your analysis of the different academic frameworks. And I think, for example, One Health has been criticized at times for having that anthropocentric focus. And what I wanted to ask is, what were your takes on multi-species ethnography as a framework to compensate a bit for that anthropocentrism, and maybe further include indigenous knowledge and practices within a multi-sectoral understanding of like the relations between environment, human, and animal health. And maybe you could provide more critical analysis of that academic framework, as you've done very well for others.
Yeah, I think these, the frameworks are always interesting, and we've had these discussions. I also work in the planetary health space, which has sort of been, and maybe I'll just point out that the reason why I gravitated towards that terminology more than the One Health specifically was that when it comes to Indigenous community viewpoints of the health of the planet and what that encapsulates, there is no differentiation between economic systems, social systems, cultural systems, wildlife systems, our systems generally. So from that concept, to be able to differentiate and be inclusive of so many other different aspects of programming that aligned more with the Indigenous translation. Now, Planetary Health originally was very anthropocentric because it was defined from a Western way of knowing. So we've pushed very hard to minimize that notion and ensure that there's a holistic understanding of how we actually operationalize, because we can say till the cows come home that we're including biodiversity, we're including ecosystems, we're including stuff, but if you notice that paper that I quoted, if you actually critique the literature, there is nothing when it comes to the concepts of Indigenous traditional knowledges. So, frameworks that have been developed outside of Indigenous contexts most often will not be inclusive, because the way of looking at the world is often, not from the perspective of relationship. And I would love to see I would love to see not only, some of these frameworks re-examined, but really contextualized through, with Indigenous groups, as we've done within Planetary Health. I think there's value of this in One Health to say, okay, well, what is this framework? Where are the sticking points? What makes sense for our communities? What doesn't make sense from our communities? Not in the goal of partnership, but just Indigenous people saying, what is this saying? Is it reflective of our lives? How do we see this? And then make those points so that we can take it back now, look at those overarching frameworks to say, okay, what's working, what's not, and what's clearly disjointed in terms of what's going to work on the ground in communities. So I think there's opportunity for many frameworks that have been created within that Western mindset, and I don't mean that to make people feel bad. I don't mean that to isolate viewpoints. I really do that to distinct the variable way of thinking from the relational way of thinking. That is the pure purpose of that. We cannot get to true health equity unless we walk through truth, as Dr. Donald Warren says. So I just want to emphasize that. I'm not trying to be critical of various people's views or upbringings, or the rest of it is really to differentiate the ways that we think about the world and how we think through the development of framework and operationalizing those frameworks. So I appreciate that question, because I think if you ask many Indigenous peoples, most of the frameworks that are developed, it's like, it's too complicated. You just got to focus on these simple things, and that makes it work. And I love that, because we're often overwhelmed with these huge issues that we have, that we're facing on the planet, with the war, with the the pandemic crisis, with climate change, of course. And I go back to my elder in my community, and she said, just remember, Nicole, just remember that it's all about love. That's all she says. And I come away from that going, I was like, yeah, she's right. Why am I worrying so much when I can make a difference in my own field of influence, to be able to change that narrative in a way that refocuses it on us in relationship to each other and to our community, including those beautiful animals that we're talking about today, because they are very much in this presentation. They do not have a voice, and it is our responsibility as Indigenous people to attempt to at least bring them into the conversation as active voice holders in that process. If you were that salamander that somebody was talking about before, what would you say?
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole, and for that question, Claudia. Let me just share a number of comments that were made in the chat. We have one by Lucy Keats, whose mic and camera doesn't work. She says, I appreciate you pointing out for this group the difference in risk between poaching for urban commercial wildlife versus commercial wildlife trade versus sustainable traditional use of wildlife by Indigenous peoples. And also points made by Yukia Sibenga, I'm sure I'm not quite pronouncing this correctly. She says, could you share your thoughts on how to ensure Indigenous people's knowledge is not lost when young people increasingly get trained and absorbed in Western thinking and approaches? In Australia, walking into worlds. Initially, generations will be able to keep their knowledge embedded, but what can we do that over more generations it is not lost eventually? And Paulina of Chinese, Javanese, and Ambonese descent, she says, points out that some of her friends from other ethnic groups, from other islands as well, felt like sometimes these narratives to retain Indigenous knowledge feel like the government tried to keep them in a museum-like way, while they want to strive and educate in what they consider as modern. Do you have any
Absolutely
comments?
It's such an important piece, because we have this very unique time in history for Indigenous peoples, where we have young people that are growing up in a technological world, and those narratives, and that's why I was referring when Christina was pointing out the importance of that youth voice, because they're sort of the bridge between two worlds in essence of that. And I don't think we need to minimize, as according to self-determination, it's up to Indigenous peoples, how they want to relate to the world, and there's no restrictions on that. However, we also need to to ensure that for those communities that want to continue and pursue, but have been marginalized in the action of retaining their lands and practicing their cultures, have the opportunity to do so. One of the biggest issues we have in my mind that is minimized, although the United Nations has called the next decade the decade of Indigenous languages, is Indigenous languages are the heart of our communities and our cultures. In fact, they hold the taxonomies of biodiversity, they hold the knowledges of the animals, of the plants, of the weather systems, but also the worldview. And we're losing one every 2 weeks right now. We just finished a paper with colleagues that one of the most fundamental elements of planetary health, or even One Health education, is the revitalization and ensuring the connectivity of Indigenous languages, which means providing resources and opportunities for language holders to pass on that information. Because without the language, it becomes very difficult to move things forward. However, Indigenous languages are fundamentally connected to the lands that they come from. So in thinking through protection, what can we do as allies? Land rights, land rights, land rights, land rights. Indigenous land tenure rights are probably the foundational piece to all of the issues. 6% of the population holds 80% of the world's biodiversity. But our Indigenous lands are being taken. There is violence happening against environmental protectors worldwide. Indigenous peoples are continually and currently being forced off of their lands for conservation and for other activities and prevented from being on those lands. That is the main political support point that we need globally, is respect and honor of Indigenous land tenure.
Thanks, Nicole. We have a couple of minutes left. I don't see any further comments at the moment. What I'm really struggling with, I hear you loud and clearly, let's put it that way. However, falling short of the opportunity as a small initiative to really go this, to strive for land rights writ large, let's say. What would you, maybe you could leave us with another couple of comments or recommendations how to move forward. I wrote a couple of down. I take your point very seriously of saying, well, give Indigenous peoples, in my words now, give Indigenous peoples the opportunity to amongst themselves talk about certain issues, and then if they decide to do so, come back to us with their insights and not expect them to come to sit at our table. That's something I heard you say earlier. I don't know whether I'm rephrasing this correctly, but on these issues, also the title, let me just say, the title of our initiative, International Alliance Against Health Risks in Wildlife Trade, was not chosen by us as a team. We actually struggled with some of our funders to change it, but it was a bit of a difficult struggle. So we have to work with that at the moment. We understand very clearly that we're, pushing towards the message of not wildlife being at fault here, but the human behavior and dealing with wildlife and etc. But also, I'm not sure. You know that we work with IPRI on a new format that will be starting next month that we call Voices from the Ground, to try to give some format, an appropriate format to some voices of Indigenous peoples. If I'm informed correctly, you commented on our first ideas and how to go about that. So we are trying to take that wisdom on board. But do you have anything else we could really work on stronger in order to really, as you said earlier, combine that wisdom and the Indigenous knowledge and knowledge systems with other scientific approaches to reduce health risk and keep and bring back benefits to those that we work with, also in Indigenous communities and peoples? Maybe I'd really like your wisdom on that.
Yeah, I think it's relevant, and many of the things that we've talked about are very sort of high level and big picture sort of elements, and that context is important to root ourselves in. But as you noted, there needs to be practical steps that can be taken in terms of mobilizing change and moving things forward within a good way. And harking back to a previous response, there's many Indigenous run organizations that have been experienced in working in multiple spaces, and they often end up being probably a good conduit of participation and action, because their mandates usually are to help influence and to help ensure that Indigenous voices are brought into various spaces. I mentioned cultural survival and the International Indian Treaty Council. There's a number like that that are very much rooted within the Indigenous context and viewpoints. And I think engaging with those types of organizations becomes easier sometimes than going straight to communities or individuals, because they may have more appetite and positionality, but also it fits with their mandate, really, to speak within these types of spaces. And then the other thing I think organizations and peoples can do is that if you're at decision-making tables, if you're in policy circles, if you're in places and you don't see people that represent diverse communities in there, you have a voice in that space, and that can be powerful in that. And we need more people speaking out to say, why are we not having representation here? Because if that doesn't happen, we're not going to see changes within that epistemological pluralism or bringing in those diverse viewpoints. And even just having that conversation is a huge step from where we've been the last 30, 50, 60 years within any of these policy spaces. It's not easy. It takes hard work. There can be some feelings of difficulty as a part of that engagement processes, but to get to true health equity, we need to walk through truth.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And I think for exactly that last, or almost last point, not the truth point, but the epistemological pluralism point, your speech or your input was enormously helpful for all of us, just understanding the interconnectedness, the way of looking at the world and being in the world, as you pointed out. At least personally, I can say I know that some of my team members are much more advanced than I was coming into this conversation. So I learned enormously, and I think we will, all of us who listen to you, we will take those aspects on board, and in all the spaces and the spheres and the conversations that we engage in, we will at least have them in our heads and hopefully bring them to the table and to the conversation. So thank you so much for that. Let me just point out two small things. One directly directed at you, but anybody who's listening, we are, as you know, and as many of you are member of our international alliance, we are just in the run-up of forming and founding our steering committee. So as we want this issue to also be represented well, we have one of 11 seats reserved for these issues and Indigenous peoples' perspectives. So I'm not sure, Nicole, whether you've considered, but let me be very blunt and say, please consider coming to join our steering committee, or let's talk about this afterwards. And the other point I wanted to make, that we as International Alliance, funded by the German government, we just put out a second call for proposals looking at innovative ways of approaching these issues. And you mentioned health in harmony, and actually that was one of our inspirational projects that we had in mind when we talked about innovative social innovation, participatory approaches. So not only to you, Nicole, but to anybody who's listening, please approach us or look at our website. I'm not sure whether we've posted it on the website yet, but we will do so shortly, because that's one of the focuses that we want this second call for proposals for members who want to implement projects. We want really to go into that direction. So just in terms of pointing out those two aspects from within the International Alliance Against Health Risks in Wildlife Trade, with all the implications. Let me finish off that conversation. I think the expert talk, we've run out of time. And Nicole, thanks again so much for your enormous wisdom, or also experience, input, but also openness. And I think we could, one of the participants also pointed out that she was glad your answer is a strong one, albeit not a simple one. I can just reiterate that. It's, as you say, it's a long way to go still, but we'd like to be part of that and contribute to that. So thanks for helping us out and guiding us in the right direction. And I hope we can continue the conversation in this format or another one. Thanks so much.
Merci, Joe. Thanks all.
And thanks to everybody else. Have a good afternoon, evening, or new day as you will. Nicole, you're just starting off into the day. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Bye-bye.
million, Nicole. Thank you.